But first, Martin, Donald Trump sends 59 cruise missiles over to Syria, to this airbase. And lucky he didn't hit any Russians, wasn't it?
Well, I don't know how many. Has anybody been killed? Do we know?
Yes, they have.
Yes, so Syrian military personnel.
It's 5 people killed, Syrians, yeah.
How would the British government react if 5 of their military personnel had been killed in an airstrike? What do you think we'd do?
I think we'd probably be pretty annoyed about it. This happened
all
at 4 a.m. in the morning. One of the things which hasn't been reported either over here, almost at all, is the evidence from the, local news agencies around there saying that there was an attack on this Shirat air base exactly at the same time on the ground from ISIS.
Well, is it ISIS that was it, or is it the other rebels that supposedly control the area where the supposed gas attack has taken place? They certainly did fly air support for ISIS at Deir ez-Zor some months ago, where 80-some-odd Syrian military personnel were killed, conscript soldiers, mostly Sunnis. And ISIS was clearly coordinating with the RAF, because the RAF flew a drone from Waddington involved in that, and they killed 80 personnel. What do you think we'd do if the Syrian army killed 80 British military personnel in Britain? How would we react to that?
Well, the reason for it, of course, is this gas attack on Tuesday. So that seems to be the reason why this is all taking place.
Yes, well, the gas attack has been blamed on Assad without any investigation whatsoever.
50 adults, 20 children killed.
Well, so they say, but we're still trying to work out what exactly happened. The source for all the information that's being used here are the white helmets and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is one guy based in Coventry, funded by the British government and others. The white helmets were set up by British military officer James Le Mesurier, and they are also funded by NATO intelligence services, and they're embedded with the rebels who are Al-Qaeda.
Well,
so the ultimate source for the information about this attack has come from Al-Qaeda. Do you remember the people that attacked the World Trade Center? They're the source of the information about this attack. And of course, as we know, Al-Qaeda are a perfectly legitimate source of information. They never tell lies. They're extremely reliable, just as reliable as they were 2 years ago when it turned out that the attack in Damascus, and it was investigated by Carlo Del Ponte for the UN, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Robert Parry.
And also Christoph Lehmann did a really in-depth report into that, which is the first time I'd come across that.
And all the evidence showed that it was actually carried out by the rebels with the help of at least of the Turkish intelligence services, MIT, which are part of NATO. So in other words, what I would say about this is not only did Assad not carry out that previous attack, and probably not this one either, but that in actual fact the rebels carried out the attack in collusion with NATO intelligence services.
Where are the rebels going to get hold of sarin gas from? Or the precursors?
From Libya. That's where the last lot came from. And of course they're capable of manufacturing it because they're getting help and support from MIT, the Turkish intelligence services, and also NATO.
Something else which has been unreported, certainly as far as I've seen in the mainstream press in this part of the world from Tuesday's attack, is that there were this is Médecins Sans Frontières reporting this, that there were 2 different types of injuries and 2 different types of gas in use in that attack. One was chlorine, the other one was this sarin, this particularly nasty nerve agent developed during the Second World War.
Yeah, well, the fact is that all of the facts are disputed at this stage. So for Trump to decide that he knows what happened and therefore that he's going to attack an airbase is A, as Putin has pointed out, that's not legal under international law because you haven't got any UN resolution. And it's not even legal under US law because he's supposed to go to Congress before he makes an act of war like that. That's in the Constitution. Now, what would happen, for example, if Trump, without going to Congress, I mean, it's possible that Congress would have backed him, although in actual fact what happened last time is they didn't back Obama, and that's why he had to back off. And, of course, Trump's base, the people who voted for him on the understanding that he wasn't going to try regime change in Syria. That was one of the things he said he wasn't going to do. So you could say, well, he's attacked this airbase now and that's the end of it. He's made his point. But, of course, it's quite possible. I don't think it would happen, but it's quite possible that the response by the Russians and the Syrians will be to sink the ship which fired the missiles. And if they can't get out of the Mediterranean, they could end up with a shooting war in the Mediterranean with loads of NATO ships sunk. And that could happen without going to Congress or whatever. I don't think that's what is going to happen. If Assad and Putin were as mad as they say, that is exactly what they would do.
Well, what the American generals are saying is that they could take out the whole Syrian Air Force in one night if they want.
I think that's bluster. I think that the Russian air defences there are quite capable of... and don't forget, the Russians got submarine...
The Russian air defences didn't do anything about these cruise missiles, did they?
No, that's because the Americans told them in advance that they were going to hit this air base, and therefore the Russians wisely decided that they were going to stand aside and let it happen. I think what the Russians and the Syrians will now do is stick to... Don't forget, they're winning the war. They've got no motive for carrying out this attack.
What about, say, for example, these aircraft that dropped this alleged gas on Tuesday did come from this airbase? If that's true, why would you bomb an airbase when there may be sarin gas being stored there?
Well, it's making a political point, isn't it? Although 5 people are dead as far as we know. And as I said earlier, what would the British government do if 5 military personnel were killed in such an airstrike on your own territory? On British territory, that would have to happen.
Now, back in 2003, the Arab League said the invasion of Iraq will open the gates of hell. That was on a BBC webpage and was quickly changed after about an hour or so. I think they thought that was a bit too much of a strong headline. But effectively, Saddam was entrapped by April Glasby back in the first Gulf War, and it does seem as if the what's been happening in the Middle East, particularly since 2003, has been an absolute disaster. Almost every single time that there's an intervention, it just causes more death and mayhem. And effectively what's now happening is most people around the world are saying, well, Syria's borders are just kind of, we're just going to have to redraw them.
Well, as I've said often on this show, Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister under Mitterrand, has been on French TV, and he said before the Arab Spring, before the uprising in Syria...
That was in 2009, he's saying, that this happened, and this was when David Miliband was the Foreign Secretary.
Yes, that's right. When David Miliband was the Foreign Secretary, it was one of the reasons why he didn't end up being Labour leader, because we don't trust him. And he said, well, the British officials approached me and said, we are going to run an armed uprising in Syria. Now, and do you want to join in? Now, the facts are pretty clear. The rebels inside Syria are extreme jihadists. They're Salafists, Wahhabis. They want to enforce Sharia law, and they're not interested in any other kind of version of Islam but their version. They are a minority. 70,000 of them come from outside Syria. They come from all over the place, from Libya, from Chechnya, and other places, and they've been armed, trained and directed by NATO intelligence services based in Turkey and Jordan. So we started the war in Syria. There wasn't a war before the British and the Americans stuck their finger in. British military personnel are on the ground inside Syria, and hopefully the Syrian army are going to catch them and blow their brains out.
Well, what about the $100 million that was spent last night on cruise missiles? They're about $1.4 million each, these things, and they obviously have to be replaced. Because the arms industry, when you get the arms industry quite close to government, then you start to wonder whether these decisions are just based on trying to make more money for the arms companies. Now, right now, we have Theresa May, the Prime Minister of Britain. Her husband, Philip May, is one of the directors of Capital Group, who are a major investor in several things, one of which is the arms industry. They're almost like a sort of mini Carlyle Group type company, Capital Group. They also invest in big pharma that do these vaccination programs. But you do wonder sometimes when these decisions are made, is who's wearing the trousers in that relationship? Is it Philip May or is it Theresa?
Well, that's another question. The role of the arms industry is pretty pernicious and always has been. Nevertheless, this precipitate decision, which, as I said earlier, Putin's already pointed out, it's not legal to attack without a UN Security Council resolution.
But what I'm trying to say is, are we getting decisions from our governments which actually represent some kind of logical, sensible, rational point of view, or is it just they're out there to make money?
No, they're not. They're not. And, of course, the difference between the Russians and the West is that the Russian arms industry is a nationalised industry. So they think very carefully about how much they want to spend and what they want to spend it on and what their goals actually are. And, in fact, the Russian parliament quite recently agreed that it was going to reduce defence spending, because they can do that. You can't do that in the West.
Well, we've also heard this week soldiers from Wiltshire, other parts of this part of the country, being shipped over to Estonia. So we've had decades of this kind of peaceful thing, which is where we're bringing in these new countries, these Eastern European countries, this lovely little fun club called NATO. Now they're right up against the Russian border. They're now actually deploying into those countries British troops.
They
US
are,
troops.
and it's provocative. It's incredibly provocative, but I don't think there's any... The Russians aren't going to start a war. They don't care. If the British want to waste money marching around in Estonia, they can do whatever they like. What they do worry about is having these anti-missile missiles in Romania and elsewhere. And, of course, what really could happen here is that the Russians finally lose patience and say, right, well, we're just not going to negotiate with you anymore. We're just going to fight you, because that's all that's left to do.
The British Defence Secretary Michael Fallon was speaking on 5 Live earlier on, where he explained why the US supported this action last night.
We're supporting it because we want to prevent the regime using chemical weapons against its own people in future and slaughtering children, as we saw in that appalling gas attack. This was a very limited but very appropriate response from the United States, targeting the airfield and the airplanes and the equipment that was used in this attack in order to deter the Syrian regime from doing anything like it again.
Well, there's no evidence, to my mind, to suggest that this regime was behind this attack. The previous attack was carried out by the rebels in order to try and bring in an airstrike. This one looks very similar to that one. And it's the same people giving us the information, the White Helmets and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, who are essentially propaganda outfits funded by NATO.
Michael Fallon was also asked, was the UK consulted?
We've been in very close contact with the American government at all levels over the last couple of days. I've spoken to my opposite number, the Defence Secretary, and our Prime Minister has been kept informed of those discussions throughout.
Well, we either weren't consulted or we were, and we said, let's go along with this. What particularly embitters me is the role of the RAF in the strike on Deir ez-Zor, which was definitely in support of ISIS and was deliberately done to undermine negotiations going on between John Kerry and his opposite number, Lavrov. So we are actually deeply involved in the Syrian war. Britain was involved in starting the Syrian war.
But isn't something similar happening...
Our special forces have been
Martin,
involved in training the terrorists.
Something similar happening today, because we've got the UN peace talks going on in Geneva just
Indeed,
about to
and
start.
that makes the timing of the whole thing so suspect. And, of course, the other thing is that there's a faction within the military in the US who wants to force Trump's hand, force him into conflict with Russia, because they were worried that he might be able to talk some peace and sense, and this is all now out of the window. So this is all great from their point of view, and of course the rebels have got a similar interest.
The crucial question, of course, Michael Fallon has to answer is there actually any evidence that President Assad was behind this chemical attack on Tuesday?
We've shared our assessment with the Americans who've done their own assessment, and we think it's highly likely that this was the regime. The regime has form in this area. It's used gas before against its own people, and it has continued to defy United Nations Security Council resolutions. And what's really important now is that we do deter the regime from carrying out further attacks in future. And that's the aim of this very limited, narrowly focused action the Americans took last night.
Well, the fact is that the previous chemical weapons attack at Ghouta, as we've said, the UN investigation, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Seymour Hersh, and various other people have all showed what happened there, and it's pretty clear that it wasn't the regime. Not only was it not the regime, it was the rebels, and the rebels working with NATO intelligence services, with sarin supplied from Libya.
But the Russians might upset the Russians here. What has Michael Fallon got to say about that?
The Russians have had every opportunity over the last 2 or 3 years to use their influence, and they have great influence over the regime, to use their influence to stop the regime attacking its own people, barrel bombing its own civilian population, using gas against its own people. You know, the Russians should be hanging their heads in shame. They should be using their influence to bring this civil war to an end.
Would you like to see a regime change in Syria?
We've always made it clear that there is no long-term future for President Assad in Syria. Somebody who's bombed his own civilians, who's been gassing his own civilians. There's no future for him. On the contrary, we want Syria to move to a more democratic settlement.
Well, President Assad stood in a democratic election in Syria and won. overwhelmingly. And even NATO's internal intelligence report, which was leaked early in the conflict, suggested that he had the support of about 70% of the population. He's got the support of all the ethnic minorities, the Christians, for example, the Shia, the Alawites, they all support him. And a substantial section of the Sunni community supports him as well, including the Grand Mufti in Damascus, who's a very senior Sunni cleric. His son was assassinated by the moderate rebels who we are supporting. And, of course, we are supporting those rebels. Those rebels are the ones that what they did at Ghouta was they took civilians who supported the regime, killed them, and then blamed the regime, which has been fairly standard practice from the beginning of the war. They kill people. Once people are dead, nobody knows what side they're on. So the rebels then show a picture of all these dead people, say, oh, they've been killed by the government. But in actual fact, their government supporters have been killed by the rebels. And they've been cooking up this stuff with the support of British Army intelligence officers like James Le Mesurier, who, frankly, should be executed.
Well, Martin's a little bit rough on the poor chap. But anyway, look, what about Michael Fallon? One of the things he was saying there was we need to get rid of Assad. But then what would happen after that? Let's have a look. Because, I mean, you would probably just be handing on the country to a bunch of different types of jihadis if Assad was gone. So Michael Fallon answered that question too.
Well, we have democracy now in Iraq, however fragile it is, and we have Iraqi armed forces, thanks to our help, now beginning to push Daesh terrorists out of all their cities. Only Mosul is left. We have to have the kind of government we've got in Iraq, which represents Shia and Sunni, can represent all the different factions. It's a fragile democracy in Iraq, I grant you that, but there is no future in Syria to be led by a dictator who's prepared to gas his own people.
It's absolute humbug. In actual fact, the coalition airstrikes in Iraq have been killing far more civilians than the very basically targeted strikes carried out by the Russians and the Syrians. Assad is by far the most popular politician in Syria. He was quite unpopular at the beginning of the Arab Spring because he was in place and the people didn't like him. But in actual fact, many of the people who originally opposed him have come around to supporting him as basically an Abraham Lincoln kind of figure, holding the country together against people who are trying to undermine it. If there is a democratic election in Syria, and the Russians and the Syrians have said we're perfectly prepared to have a UN supervised election, Assad has got to be allowed to stand because Assad's the most popular politician in the country. Can anybody on the British or American side name a single politician in Syria who could beat Assad in an election? And of course they can't.
What's the point of Britain and the US supporting this kind of action? Because it really only seems to benefit Israeli foreign policy. Well,
they're the ones who they of course have got their own interests in the Yinon plan of destabilising their neighbours. They want to seize the Golan Heights because they've got oil in them. And in any case, the whole problem is that they want to the Saudis wanted to build an oil pipeline through Syria to Turkey, and then, of course, the Syrians wanted to build an oil pipeline from Iran to Syria to supply the European market. And so underlying all of this is the usual geopolitics of oil and money. And the Western powers have tried to overthrow the Ba'athist regime in Syria several times. They've always failed, because ultimately you can't win a war like the one in Syria if you don't have popular support. The Syrian Arab army has taken 160,000 casualties, I think, and they've managed to carry on fighting. That's because they believe in winning, and they're not going to give in until they have won. And there's no way that the West is going to win this, no matter how hard they huff and puff and no matter how strong they get. If it comes to an absolute straight-down fight, it'll be interesting to see what happens to the US and British navies in the Gulf and in the Mediterranean.
Well, one thing's for sure, the people of Iraq and Syria will lose.
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.